From a small garage on the outskirts of Portland, a humble mechanic named Mark Davis battled life's relentless storms. Dents marked his heart as much as the rust marred every wrench in his worn-out toolbox. Then, in the strangest twist of fate, an elegant woman whisked into his workshop with an impossible request: fix an engine so complicated seasoned professionals had given up long ago. Little did Mark know this solitary act of kindness would upend his entire world. Engines and heartbreak had never slowed him down. But when that woman removed her ring, she unleashed a secret that changed everything. Mark Davis wiped the sweat off his brow with the back of his hand and glanced around the cluttered workshop. His father's old shop, Davis Auto and Repairs, had once echoed with laughter and brimming confidence. Now it was a lonely place, half-empty tool shelves, a grease-stained floor, and a tattered sign out front that threatened to fall off at any moment. The summer heat seeped in through the cracked windows, making the interior feel like an oven. But Mark preferred the heat to the biting cold that often settled over Portland's outskirts in winter, when customers dried up, and every bill on the table turned into a mountain he struggled to climb. He sighed, remembering his father, Richard Davis, who had instilled in him the principles of honesty, hard work, and giving more than you take. Since his father's passing 3 years earlier, Mark had been forced to become resourceful, searching for used parts at junkyards, repurposing scraps, and relying on the good grace of old contacts who occasionally gifted him some leftover inventory. Business had become sparse. He specialized in older model cars nobody else wanted to deal with, sometimes classic beauties from the 1950s, sometimes run-down pickups that rumbled past the city limits. But times changed. People either bought brand-new cars or found large-scale service centers that offered quicker, cheaper fixes. He heard the faint sound of footsteps at the open garage door, expecting another deadbeat request he'd have to turn down, or an eviction notice. Mark forced a friendly expression on his face. In walked a man named Stephen M. Williams, a local who sometimes gave Mark small jobs on farm machinery. Stephen wasn't exactly wealthy, but he knew people, farmers, tradespeople, and repair shops that needed help Mark could provide. "I have a lead, Mark," Stephen said. "A wealthy landowner just outside town has a complicated engine problem. Some folks tried to fix it and failed. She's looking for someone with a bit of a personal touch and a lot of grit." Mark nodded slowly. "I don't exactly have the spare parts for fancy experimental engines. You sure it's something I can handle here?" Stephen shrugged. "She asked for you by name, but she's, well, not from around here. Seems she's heard from some contact that you're good with unique repairs. Her name is Elizabeth Roth." Mark frowned. Never heard that name before. "She asked for me specifically." Stephen chuckled. "Don't act so surprised. Word travels. You fixed that old Model T for the museum last summer. That was quite an accomplishment, and a few folks took notice. Anyway, Ms. Roth's estate is about 20 miles out." I jotted down the address. "Might be worth your while to pay her a visit. Maybe it's nothing, but it could be the lucky break you need." Mark took the piece of paper with neat handwriting indicating an address he only vaguely recognized. "Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate your help." Watching Stephen stride away, Mark began to wonder if he should even bother. The phone hadn't rung in days, and he was dangerously behind on rent insurance and medical bills for his mother, who now lived in a small assisted living facility. A single big job could change everything. With a sense of guarded optimism, Mark packed a few essential tools, hopped into his battered 1985 Chevrolet truck, its red paint now chipped and dull, and headed out. The drive to the Roth estate took him through winding roads with ancient oaks, rolling hills and farmland. He felt a surge of nostalgia. His father used to take him on scenic drives along these back roads, explaining the mechanics of engines and the beauty of living away from city chaos. Mark could practically hear his father's calming baritone in the rustle of the wind that seeped through the half-stuck window. Eventually, Mark reached tall wrought-iron gates flanked by smooth marble columns. A guardhouse stood at the entrance. He stopped, rolled down his window, and offered the slip of paper. The guard, a stern-faced middle-aged man, shot Mark a suspicious look. But after glancing at the note, he pressed a button, and the massive gates swung open. He drove along a gravel path lined with carefully pruned hedges that reminded him of something from an English manor. The main house, a sprawling 3-story structure, loomed at the end of the path, its white facade glowing in the afternoon sun. Mark's truck sputtered to a stop near a row of pristine cars. Exotic models, foreign and domestic, silently boasted the owner's wealth: a Bentley, a classic Mustang that looked brand new, and a sleek black SUV he couldn't even name. With a heavy breath, Mark turned off the ignition. His greasy overalls, worn boots and baseball cap clashed starkly with the estate's elegant atmosphere. For a moment he considered cleaning the grime off his hands, but he lacked a rag and felt that no matter what, his entire appearance would remain the antithesis of wealth. A slender woman stepped out of the front door. She wore a crisp blouse and a simple skirt. Her face was sharp, her short hair pinned behind her ears. She approached, introducing herself as Catherine Ms. Roth's personal assistant. After a polite greeting, she led him around the house to a large private workshop building in the back. Inside, Mark's eyes fell upon a monstrous machine, some kind of specialized generator, larger and more complex than anything he'd encountered. It had an arrangement of pipes, wires, and tubes, reminiscent of an industrial puzzle. He whistled low and astonished. From behind the generator, a voice spoke. "Mr. Davis, I presume." He turned. That had to be Elizabeth Roth. Tall, poised, with long auburn hair and eyes that exuded quiet confidence, she wore dark jeans and a fitted leather jacket. Not quite the image of a typical wealthy socialite. A diamond ring glittered on her left hand, but her presence carried an independent aura. "Ma'am," Mark said, touching the brim of his cap. "You can call me Elizabeth," she replied. "Thank you for coming. I've heard you're talented with challenging restorations." Mark squared his shoulders. "I do my best, yes." She nodded, gesturing to the generator. "This project is important to me for reasons I prefer to keep private. Some of the best mechanics in the city have tried to fix this. They even flew in an engineer from Chicago, David Farnham, if you've heard the name. He left after 3 days, saying it was beyond repair. But there must be a way. If you can at least figure it out, I'll make sure you're well compensated." Mark felt his mouth go dry. "Well, I'd be honored to try. I can't promise a miracle, but I'll give it my best shot." Elizabeth offered a slight smile, and for a fleeting second, Mark thought he saw something like relief. Catherine showed him the utility sink and gave him a set of protective gloves. Mark set down his tool bag, heart thumping with anticipation and a healthy dose of nerves. He rolled up his sleeves and began examining the generator's labyrinthine innards. Hours slipped by as Mark tinkered with the generator. He identified a series of faulty valves, mismatched wiring harnesses, and a control panel that seemed hastily retrofitted. None of it followed a standard design. Elizabeth watched from a corner occasionally, asking clarifying questions, but mostly letting him work in silence. When Mark asked for certain tools or if he needed help obtaining specific parts. Elizabeth nodded and wrote down notes. She even made a few calls instructing Catherine to expedite any orders. Mark was quietly grateful so often he found himself scavenging junkyards, but here he had at least a promise of proper resources. Despite the progress he made in diagnosing the sheer complexity baffled him. Something about the setup didn't match typical commercial or residential use. It reminded him of specialized engines or generators used in racing teams or advanced labs. In the back of his mind, he wondered, why does she have such a high-tech generator hidden behind her mansion? As the sun began to set, Mark suggested reconvening in the morning. Elizabeth didn't argue. She escorted him back to his truck, and on the way, Mark couldn't hold his curiosity any longer. "I don't mean to pry," he said gently, "but is there something about this generator I should know? It's unusual." Elizabeth paused, looking at the imposing structure of her home against the dimming sky. "It belonged to my father," she said at last. "He had certain research interests. I'd like to restore it in his memory, and perhaps see if it can be used for a philanthropic project." She glanced at Mark, a glint of vulnerability in her eyes. "I hope that's enough explanation." "Of course," Mark responded quickly. "I'll do everything I can to fix it." She nodded and reached into her pocket, extracting an envelope. "For your time so far. I insist." He opened it and saw more cash than he expected, enough to pay for a month or two of his mother's bills. He swallowed hard. "Ma'am Elizabeth, I haven't earned this yet. I haven't fixed anything." She shook her head. "Call it a retainer. And please use it for what you need. If you decide to continue working on the generator, I'll compensate you further. If at any point you need help acquiring parts or you run into personal difficulties, just let me or Catherine know. I value people who work hard." An unspoken understanding seemed to pass between them. Mark, for the first time in months, felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just the money. It was the recognition, the chance to do something significant. He thanked her, hopped into his truck, and drove away, with his heart hammering in his chest. The following morning, Mark arrived bright and early. To his surprise, Elizabeth was already in the workshop, sipping coffee from a paper cup. She offered him one. "Black, right?" Mark blinked. "How did you—" "Catherine told me," Elizabeth said with a shrug, as though it was the most ordinary thing to do for a man she'd met only a day before. Mark appreciated the gesture, the warmth radiating from the small kindness. They fell into a comfortable routine, Mark making small progress on the generator, Elizabeth either observing or stepping away to handle matters in the house. At lunchtime, Catherine would bring them sandwiches, and Elizabeth would ask Mark about his background, where he'd learned the mechanical skills, how he'd managed to restore those older cars. They talked about the community's troubles, how local shops were shutting down in the face of corporate giants. Mark found it surprisingly easy to talk to her, though he kept certain pains to himself, like his mother's medical bills and the struggles to keep the shop afloat. "Maybe you can upgrade your shop once you're done here," Elizabeth mused. "I know people who'd appreciate someone with your dedication." Mark gave a lopsided grin. "I guess that'd be nice," he said. "But Davis Auto was my father's dream. I can't imagine it any other way." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that sense of legacy. There was a soft sadness behind her gaze whenever the topic of fathers came up, and Mark wondered about her family story. If her father had built or purchased that generator for some elaborate project, he must have been an extraordinary man. As the day wore on, the tension in the workshop became more tangible, not tension between Mark and Elizabeth, but tension within Mark himself. The deeper he delved into the generator, the more secrets he discovered. On the surface, it was an advanced piece of machinery, but some modifications seemed borderline experimental, as though it once served as a prototype for something bigger, maybe energy storage or advanced engine testing. He suspected the complexity was so intimidating that previous mechanics had walked away rather than risking a half-baked solution. Around 4 in the afternoon, a new figure interrupted them. A tall, handsome man in a designer suit strolled into the workshop. He frowned at the sight of Mark in grubby overalls, rummaging through a labyrinth of wires. He called Elizabeth's name with a tone that exuded familiarity and impatience. Elizabeth turned, and a crease appeared between her brows. "Calvin," she said, her tone guarded. Mark wiped his hands. Calvin stepped closer to Elizabeth, ignoring Mark. He reached for her hand where her diamond ring sparkled and gently squeezed her fingers. "You haven't been answering my calls," he said. "I've been busy," Elizabeth said, gesturing to Mark and the generator. "We're close to some breakthroughs." Calvin barely spared Mark a glance. "Shouldn't you hire a professional from the city? Someone with a more established reputation?" Elizabeth's lips tightened. "Mr. Davis is exactly who I need right now," she said, her voice resolute. She gently freed her hand from Calvin's. "Why are you here anyway?" "I wanted to check on you," Calvin replied, scanning the workshop with disdain. "We have events coming up, fundraisers, galas, and you're holed up out here with, well..." He trailed off, letting his implications hang in the air. Mark's jaw tightened, but he swallowed any retort. Elizabeth looked at Mark with an almost apologetic glimmer, as if she regretted Calvin's words. "That will be all for now, Mr. Davis," she finally said, turning to Mark. "I'll see you tomorrow. Catherine will show you out." Mark nodded, feeling dismissed, but understanding that Elizabeth needed to handle her personal affairs. He left the estate with a mixture of triumph he'd made further progress on the generator, and unease at the man who had breezed in wearing $1,000 suit and an air of entitlement. That evening, Mark visited his mother at the assisted living facility. She was dozing lightly in her chair by the window. From her tiny room, she had a view of a garden with lush flowers. He remembered how she used to plant roses in their front yard when he was a boy. "Ma," he whispered, gently nudging her shoulder. She stirred and smiled up at him. "Mark, you look tired." "Long day at work," he admitted. He spent the next half hour telling her about the generator, the estate, the possibility of stable income. He left out the tensions, focusing on the hope that soon he'd have enough money to take better care of her. She held his hand, her skin warm and paper-thin. "You're a good son," she said. "Your father would be proud." He bit his lip, forcing back tears. "I hope so, Ma." Leaving the facility, Mark felt renewed determination. He needed to fix that generator and ensure Elizabeth's satisfaction. This job could be his lifeline, the key to paying off debts, securing a stable life for him and his mother. Little did he suspect how drastically his life was about to change, not just financially, but emotionally as well. Back at the Roth estate the next day, Mark arrived to find Calvin again, leaning against a sleek Mercedes. The well-groomed man smirked as Mark parked his old truck. "You're early," Calvin said. "Got something to prove," Mark responded with a polite nod, refusing to be baited. "Good morning," Calvin sighed dramatically. "I guess Elizabeth is still inside." "Mind telling her I'm waiting?" Mark frowned. "I'm just the mechanic. I'm sure Catherine can help you." With a dismissive wave, Calvin sauntered off towards the house. Mark shook his head, ignoring the tension and focusing on the job. He slipped on his gloves and approached the generator once more. That morning, the generator gave him more trouble than usual. A crucial part refused to fit into place due to a warped metal casing. Mark tried conventional means, welding adjusting the angles with specialized clamps. Nothing seemed to work. He found himself cursing under his breath. Hours flew by. When he tried to order an original part, Catherine informed him it was discontinued. Elizabeth approached around midday, seeing the frustration etched on his face. "Is there a workaround?" she asked. Mark sighed. "I can fabricate a piece that might mimic the original function, but it'll be tricky. I might need access to a CNC machine or a specialized metal fabricator. I know a guy, Stephen Johnson, out in Cleveland who could custom make it, but it'll take time." Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "Let's do it," she said decisively. "I'll cover the costs. Just give Catherine the details." Mark exhaled, relieved. "Thank you. I promise I won't stop until this machine purrs like a kitten." Elizabeth offered a small smile. "I trust you." Over the next weeks, Mark juggled back and forth shipments, daily visits to the Roth estate, and weekend calls to his mother's doctors. He spent long hours hunched over the generator, meticulously retracing the labyrinth of wires and replacing decades-old hardware. He discovered compartments within compartments, some containing notes, scribbled in an older man's handwriting, likely Elizabeth's father's. It appeared that the machine was once intended to power an entire facility off-grid using alternative fuels. It was visionary decades ahead of its time, but lacked final adjustments. During this process, Mark learned more about Elizabeth. She was an only child, and her father had passed away under mysterious circumstances the previous year, leaving behind vast properties, a business empire, and countless secrets. She inherited everything, but seemed uninterested in the glitzy side of wealth. She wanted to preserve her father's philanthropic initiatives, focusing on environmental technology and scientific research. That's why the generator was so important. It represented not just an innovative piece of equipment, but also her father's unfinished dream. Calvin, on the other hand, represented a more traditional route. He came from old money. He wanted Elizabeth to tie herself to high society events, bridging alliances, dealing in acquisitions that would expand her father's empire into mainstream profitability. He pressured her to sign deals that would supply oil-based products, completely disregarding her father's vision for clean, sustainable energy. And Elizabeth, though engaged to Calvin, seemed torn bound by a sense of familial duty and the future her father wanted. Sometimes Mark would witness their arguments from afar, or see Elizabeth standing alone afterward, eyes distant ring, glinting under artificial lights. He felt a strange pull, a desire to protect her from a life that clearly didn't satisfy her. Then again, it wasn't his place. He was just the mechanic, after all. One balmy afternoon, Mark found Elizabeth alone in the workshop, staring at the half-disassembled generator. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped. He gently cleared his throat. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She turned, startled, her cheeks colored slightly. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Mark gestured to the scattered components. "I'm sorry about the mess. I'll have it organized soon. We're close to a breakthrough." Elizabeth shook her head. "It's not that. I just keep wondering if I'm clinging to a dream that's impossible." She walked around the generator, running a hand over the cold metal. "Ever since my father died, I've been struggling to maintain his legacy. People like Calvin want me to do things differently, to forget all this. But my father believed in new energy solutions in a future that wasn't controlled by a handful of corporations. I can't let that go. Mark listened intently. Sometimes we have to fight for what we believe in, even if it's hard, he said quietly, thinking of his own father's shop. Truth is, people will call you crazy until you succeed. Then they'll call you a visionary. Elizabeth let out a short laugh. That's surprisingly comforting. She paused, meeting Mark's gaze. You could have given up on this generator weeks ago. Everyone else did. Why do you keep going? Mark hesitated, but the compassion in her eyes was disarming. He admitted that he needed the job to support his mother, to keep the family shop alive. But beyond that, he confessed that he felt a connection to her father's dream. Something about it reminded him of his dad's passion for innovation, even if it was just on old cars, rather than cutting-edge technology. That's beautiful, Elizabeth said softly. Thank you for sharing. She reached out as if to place a hand on his arm, but Calvin's voice cut through the workshop. Elizabeth Calvin strode in, scanning the scene. Mark stepped back instinctively, shifting into a polite stance. Calvin's gaze flicked between them, eyes narrowing. Sorry to interrupt, he said. Not sounding apologetic at all, but we have a meeting with the board in an hour. Elizabeth nodded, withdrawing. Right, I'll be ready in a moment. Calvin eyed Mark's tools and grease-streaked face. Sure you're not wasting your time here, Elizabeth. We've got bigger things to handle. She lifted her chin. It's my time to waste, Calvin. Turning to Mark, she gave him a resolute look. Do whatever you need to keep progress going. I'll approve any expenses. Mark nodded, grateful but also uneasy at the silent tension between Elizabeth and her fiancé. He felt like he was caught in a crossfire he had no business being in. Yet as he watched them walk away, a kernel of protectiveness rooted deeper in his heart. The next week saw frantic efforts to piece the generator back together. Stephen Johnson from Cleveland shipped custom parts that fit perfectly, thanks to Mark's detailed sketches and measurements. Mark worked late into the night, sometimes forgetting to eat. Elizabeth occasionally joined him, bringing hot coffee or soup, and though they didn't speak much, an unspoken camaraderie wrapped around them. Midway through that week, Mark's mother fell ill. The doctors told him over the phone that she needed a specialized procedure to manage her deteriorating heart condition. The cost was astronomical. That evening, Mark felt despair creeping in. Even with Elizabeth's payments, it wouldn't be enough unless he finished the generator soon and earned the final larger sum she'd promised. As if sensing his turmoil, Elizabeth asked if something was wrong. She found him outside, leaning against his old truck, eyes distant on the star-speckled sky. Mark hesitated, but finally confided about his mother's condition. He didn't ask for help directly. It wasn't his style to beg. He simply explained his fears, how he might have to sell the last of his father's shop equipment to keep up with medical bills. Elizabeth listened, her expression crestfallen. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. If this generator is successful, she said, I'll do everything I can to support you. But if you need an advance now... Mark shook his head firmly. No, I can't. I have to earn that money. It has to be honest. Her lips curved in a sad smile. You are honest, Mark. More honest than most people I know. They stood there under the moonlight, two souls carrying heavy legacies. Neither spoke for a while. Eventually, Mark cleared his throat, his eyes flicking to the large diamond ring on Elizabeth's finger, a ring that symbolized a future with a man who seemed to belittle her dreams. The thought made him uneasy and a bit sad. Days later, the big moment arrived. After countless hours of labor, Mark believed the generator was ready for a test. He triple-checked the wiring, the new valves, every last nut and bolt. Elizabeth hovered nearby, excitement and nervousness flickering across her features. Even Calvin decided to show up. Though Mark suspected it was just to prove the machine wouldn't work. The plan was to power up the generator on a low load and slowly ramp it up. Mark flicked a series of switches. The generator groaned, sputtered, and then started humming. A spark of electricity coursed through the cables. Mark's heart pounded in his ears. He carefully dialed up the load. The machine maintained stability. Then a full load test. Steam hissed from a vent. For a tense minute, the generator rattled as though uncertain of its revival. Then it settled into a steady purr. Elizabeth clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. Calvin raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Catherine cheered softly from the back. Mark let out a whoop, arms thrust in the air. He walked around the generator, double-checking the gauges. Everything read normal. Elizabeth turned off the generator and rushed over, shaking Mark's hand vigorously. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling. "I thank you." Mark's grin was wide. "It's all about patience and the right parts." "And not giving up," he said. He glanced at Calvin, who wore a muted scowl. This victory was not his to share. Buoyed by the success, Mark began gathering his tools, expecting to settle his payment soon and rush off to secure his mother's medical care. He could barely contain his relief. It felt like salvation was finally within reach. But Elizabeth's phone buzzed. She answered, voice tight with worry. Apparently the board meeting that Calvin had insisted on was going badly. Some major investors had threatened to withdraw from her father's projects because they wanted to pivot toward more profitable, less environmentally conscious ventures. Elizabeth ended the call, pale. "I need to fly to Chicago," she said to Mark. "This is an emergency." The demonstration of this generator was supposed to convince them that we're onto something groundbreaking. But they want immediate profit, not a long-term vision. Mark felt a chill. If the board withdrew funds, Elizabeth might not have the liquidity to pay him as promised. He tried not to let panic show on his face. "Is there anything I can do?" She looked at him, eyes filled with gratitude and regret. "Just wait a bit. I promise I'll handle this and come back to settle everything. I won't leave you stranded." She turned to Catherine, instructing her to arrange her flight. Calvin stepped forward. "We're leaving tonight," he said, taking Elizabeth's arm. "This is bigger than some old hunk of metal. We need to secure the company's future." Mark clenched his teeth. The swirl of events threatened to unravel everything he'd worked for. Still, he forced a smile. "I trust you, Elizabeth. Good luck." With that, she left ring still glittering on her finger, and Mark felt a desperate swirl in his gut. He had the victory, but not the reward. There was nothing he could do but wait. 2 days passed with no word. 3 days, 4. Mark tried not to despair. He spent his time cleaning the workshop, ensuring the generator's condition remained pristine. Catherine had been left behind, but was tight-lipped, only saying that Elizabeth and Calvin were locked in negotiations. The entire estate felt eerily still. Meanwhile, Mark's mother's condition worsened. The doctors told him they couldn't wait longer. They needed a deposit. Faced with the horrifying reality of losing her, Mark made a gut-wrenching decision. He put the last of his father's shop equipment up for sale. Each phone call and negotiation felt like a knife in his heart, but he refused to let his mother suffer. He was in the midst of finalizing the sale of a prized 1967 engine hoist, his father's personal favorite, when a sleek black SUV tore up the gravel driveway. Elizabeth emerged, looking disheveled eyes red from what seemed like tears or lack of sleep. She rushed toward Mark. "Mark, don't do that," she panted. "Please don't sell your father's equipment. I have your payment." He stood there, stunned. "Elizabeth, what happened?" She raised a trembling hand. The diamond ring was gone from her finger. In its place was a faint mark on her skin where the ring had pressed for so long. I ended things with Calvin," she said, voice quavering. Mark blinked, stunned. "You what?" She swallowed, tears brimming. "We had an enormous argument. He and the board demanded I give up on my father's philanthropic projects. They want to pivot everything. When I refused, Calvin tried to manipulate me, threatened to cause a scandal, but I won't marry someone who doesn't believe in what I stand for. So I walked away. I sold some of my personal assets and—" She reached into her bag, pulled out a thick envelope, and handed it to Mark. "Here. This is your payment plus extra for your mother's care." Mark stared, speechless. The sum inside was more than enough for the hospital bills, more than enough to save his father's shop. Elizabeth was— I don't know what to say. She let out a shaky breath. "Say you'll keep fighting for your father's legacy like I'm fighting for mine. And please let me help with your mother's bills as a thank you. Without you, the generator would still be a hunk of metal, and I would be stuck in a life that didn't feel right. Overwhelmed, I simply nodded. Tears threatened to slip from his eyes, but he blinked them away. "I don't know how to repay you," he stammered, "but I promise I'll use this money wisely." Elizabeth gave a tearful laugh. "Just keep your shop running. It reminds me of everything my father stood for. Passion, perseverance, innovation." She paused, gaze lingering on Mark. "You helped me more than you realize, Mark. If you hadn't been here, I might have caved to the pressure. Seeing your dedication inspired me. I realized I didn't want to live in a gilded cage with a man I don't love." He swallowed, heart thudding. She had used the word love so plainly, so meaningfully. He cleared his throat, stepping back. Where are you going to live now? Are you staying here? What about the estate?" A faint smile crossed her lips. "The estate is mine. Calvin has no claim to it. The board might push me to sell off some assets, but not this house. I'm still determined to show them what this generator can do, how it could revolutionize parts of the energy market. It's going to be a battle, but at least now I'm fighting it on my terms." Mark exhaled deeply. He looked at the envelope in his hand, then at Elizabeth, her left hand free of the ring that had once symbolized a future she didn't desire. An unspoken understanding flickered between them. Gratitude, admiration, maybe the seeds of something more. But for now, the moment was enough. He had what he needed to save his mother, and she had the freedom to pursue her dreams. With the new funds, Mark rushed to the hospital. He paid the deposit, scheduled his mother's procedure, and sat by her bedside, holding her hand through anxious hours. The surgery went well, and the doctors were optimistic. She would need recovery time, but with consistent care, she could regain her strength. Each day after visiting his mother, Mark returned to Davis Auto and Repairs, determined to rebuild. He replaced the equipment he'd sold, spruced up the interior, even hired a part-time helper to handle the growing business. Word spread quickly that Mark Davis was the man who could fix anything, and with Elizabeth Roth's endorsement, wealthy clients from nearby areas brought their fancy cars and specialty machinery. For the first time in years, Davis Auto thrived. Every so often, Elizabeth dropped by. She usually wore casual clothes, jeans, a simple blouse, the epitome of understated elegance. She'd chat with Mark, see how business was going, and share updates about her ongoing battles with the board. She was forging alliances, bringing new investors who believed in green technology. The once distant dream of finishing her father's work was starting to look more tangible. One late afternoon, Elizabeth came by the shop. Mark was up to his elbows in grease, working on an engine that had overheated. She smiled at the sight, rummaged in her purse, and handed him a cold bottle of water. "Thanks," he said, wiping his brow. "You're a lifesaver." She perched on a wooden stool, looking around at the busy hum of the shop. "It's amazing," she said. "A few months ago, this place was practically empty." Mark followed her gaze. 2 freshly painted lifts, bright overhead lights, new tool cabinets brimming with modern equipment, everything shining with renewed purpose. "Couldn't have done it without you," Mark said. Elizabeth shook her head. "You did this. I just gave you a push." They sat in comfortable silence. Finally, Elizabeth cleared her throat. "Mark, I was wondering if you're free this weekend." He turned, meeting her gaze. "Sure I can be." "Why?" She twisted her hands in her lap, nervous. "I'm hosting a small event at the estate, a demonstration of the generator for a group of investors who value sustainability. It's basically the last push to secure the capital I need to keep my father's projects alive. I'd like you to be there. You know the machine better than anyone." Mark hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his forte. But how could he say no? I'd be honored. A grateful smile blossomed on her face. "Thank you." Saturday arrived, and Mark found himself in a tailored suit Elizabeth had arranged a far cry from his oil-stained overalls. He arrived at the estate just before sunset. Caterers moved busily around the manicured grounds, setting up canapes and wine stations. A small stage had been erected near the workshop. Rich men and women in elegant attire mingled, sipping champagne, discussing business deals. Mark swallowed hard. He felt out of place among these corporate giants. Elizabeth, dressed in a tasteful midnight blue dress, spotted him and made her way over. She looked stunning confidence, radiating from her posture. "You look sharp," she said warmly. He tugged at his collar. "I feel like a fish out of water." She gently touched his arm. "You'll do great. Just answer their questions honestly." When the demonstration began, Elizabeth introduced Mark as the genius mechanic who brought the machine back to life. He walked the investors through the technicalities, showcasing the generator's efficiency, explaining how it could run on alternative fuels. He demonstrated the system's adaptability, powering lights machines, and even a portion of the estate's power grid. The group murmured with surprise and admiration. Elizabeth then spoke passionately about her father's vision, a network of self-sustaining energy units that could power communities, reduce reliance on traditional grids, and lower the carbon footprint. She concluded by pointing to the generator behind her. With Mark's help, this old machine was resurrected. And with your help, we can create an entire future where families don't worry about blackouts, pollution, or skyrocketing energy bills. A wave of applause followed. Mark caught Elizabeth's eye. She beamed, and he felt his heart swell with pride, for her, for them, for everything they'd accomplished. As the evening wore on, potential investors approached Mark, peppering him with questions about the generator, the prototypes, the feasibility. He answered as best he could. Elizabeth flitted around, forging connections, exchanging business cards. He watched her in awe, her grace, intelligence, and unwavering dedication. One investor, a middle-aged woman named Rebecca Chang, expressed genuine excitement. Miss Roth, I've seen dozens of renewable energy proposals. This is the first time I've seen a real demonstration that's feasible on a medium scale. Consider me interested. Elizabeth's eyes glowed. Thank you. I'll send you more data soon. The fundraiser ended with a sense of promise. Elizabeth saw off the final guests lingering in the moonlit courtyard with Mark at her side. The night air was cool, the stars twinkling overhead. You were amazing, she said to Mark. I think we just secured enough backers to move forward. He smiled softly. You made a better pitch than any salesman I've ever seen. Your father would be proud. She blinked back tears. I hope so. They stared at each other under the gentle glow of string lights draping the courtyard. Mark felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, admiration, something deeper that he'd tried to suppress. Elizabeth seemed to read his thoughts, stepping closer. Her hand found his no-diamond ring between them now. Elizabeth, he began, voice cracking. She put a finger to his lips, then replaced it with her own lips, kissing him softly. It was a kiss filled with unspoken apologies and thank yous with every word that had built up over the weeks. Mark's heart hammered as he returned the kiss, arms wrapping around her waist. When they finally pulled apart, the world felt still. Elizabeth exhaled shakily. I'm sorry if that was too forward. Mark silenced her with another tender kiss. No apologies, he murmured. We've come a long way. The next weeks ushered in a whirlwind of transitions. Elizabeth busied herself finalizing contracts, ensuring the board recognized her plan. Calvin's name occasionally popped up in the business circles, sowing seeds of doubt or rumor. But Elizabeth stood firm. She and Mark spent time together. Though both were busy, Mark at the shop, Elizabeth meeting with lawyers and engineers. They navigated the complexities of an unconventional relationship. She was a wealthy heiress, though not by choice, while he was a small-town mechanic from the wrong side of the tracks. Yet they shared a stubborn streak, a devotion to their father's memories, and a desire to do something meaningful with their lives. Mark's mother slowly recovered, bonding with Elizabeth during her visits. They all shared quiet dinners in the living room of Mark's modest home, joking that they'd begun a strange new family, one born of unorthodox circumstances, but anchored by genuine care. One bright morning, bad news struck. A major investor suddenly backed out of Elizabeth's project, claiming that the risk outweighed the potential reward. The board threatened to halt funding again. Tensions mounted. Elizabeth locked herself in her office trying to salvage the contracts. Worried Mark rushed to the estate. Catherine ushered him to Elizabeth's private study, where she sat surrounded by paperwork and a half-eaten sandwich. She looked up, eyes puffy from lack of sleep. It's unraveling, she whispered. They pulled a major chunk of capital. I have 30 days to find a new investor, or the project goes under. Mark crouched beside her. We've come too far to let it fail. What can I do? She gave him a tired smile. Just be here. I feel so alone in these negotiations. He squeezed her hand. You're not alone. Then, in a twist of fate, a letter arrived from a foundation in Seattle that Mark's old friend Stephen Williams had contacted. It turned out that one of the foundation's trustees was an advocate for clean energy and had read about Elizabeth's generator demonstration in a trade magazine. They were willing to step in, provided they saw a formal business plan and a few prototypes. Elizabeth read the letter with trembling hands, hope igniting in her eyes. It's possible. We might still make this work. For the next month, Elizabeth and Mark worked tirelessly. He offered input on mechanical aspects, ensuring the proposal showcased feasible expansions of the generator's design. Elizabeth polished the business angle with Catherine's help, focusing on potential markets in rural communities and disaster-prone regions. The Seattle Foundation required multiple Zoom meetings, site visits, and third-party engineering reviews. Elizabeth handled it all gracefully, leaning on Mark's technical knowledge whenever necessary. On the final day before the board's deadline, the foundation delivered its verdict. They were in. They'd provide the capital needed to develop the generator into a viable product for large-scale testing. Not only that, they pledged to build a research facility on Elizabeth's estate, turning it into a hub for green innovation. The board had no choice but to comply. Elizabeth broke the news to Mark in person. She ran into the shop, practically beaming documents in hand. They approved it. "We're saved," he laughed, lifting her in a spontaneous spin as the garage staff whooped and cheered. The best part, Elizabeth told him, was that the sale or partial sale of the estate was off the table. She retained full ownership. This meant she could move ahead with her philanthropic vision without corporate strong-arming. In the weeks that followed, construction plans for a small research wing began on the far side of the Roth estate. Elizabeth and Mark walked the grounds together, discussing the details. It became a ritual, strolling hand in hand, dreaming of a future where clean energy was the norm, where small towns could thrive with local power grids, and where families like Mark's and Elizabeth's could find dignity and purpose. Occasionally they encountered roadblocks, bureaucratic red tape, or old corporate adversaries, but they faced them together. Mark discovered a knack for innovation, sometimes brainstorming mechanical solutions in the middle of the night. Elizabeth discovered deeper wells of courage within herself. Their bond grew stronger with every challenge rooted in mutual respect and shared vision. Eventually, they organized a public unveiling of the new facility. Media outlets arrived curious about the story of the once-forgotten generator that sparked an entire movement. Elizabeth addressed the crowd, highlighting how her father's legacy and Mark's skill brought this dream to life. Mark, standing at the periphery, tried to remain inconspicuous in a crisp shirt and slacks, but Elizabeth beckoned him to the podium. He spoke shyly of perseverance, of believing in something bigger than oneself, and the crowd applauded. His mother, now stronger, was in the front row, tears glistening as she watched her son stand shoulder to shoulder with the powerful and influential and belong there. That evening they celebrated with a lavish dinner in the estate's grand ballroom. The tension of past months dissolved into laughter and toasts. Even Catherine let loose, dancing with the facility's lead engineer. Elizabeth and Mark shared a dance under the chandelier. He held her close, the memory of that first kiss, still as vibrant as ever. Days turned into weeks, and a new normal set in. Mark still ran Davis Auto and Repairs. He refused to abandon his father's shop, no matter how profitable his new endeavors might become. But on select days he worked as a consultant to the research facility, tinkering with prototypes and offering hands-on solutions that baffled engineers with fancy degrees. Elizabeth, freed from the constraints of an unwanted engagement and rigid board politics, thrived in her role as a philanthropist and innovator. She and Mark began talking about traveling to conferences, showcasing what they'd accomplished, urging other communities to adopt green technology. And though they had no immediate plans for marriage, they often joked about the day she took off her ring, how it symbolized the moment she chose a path of authenticity over one dictated by power and tradition. The morning air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of falling leaves. The trees lining the street outside Davis Auto and Repairs had turned vibrant shades of amber and gold, their branches rustling softly in the autumn breeze. Inside the garage, Mark was bent over a vintage motorcycle sleeves, rolled up, grease smudged on his forearms, the roar of a small engine echoing briefly before he silenced it. He heard the familiar purr of tires on gravel and glanced up just in time to see Elizabeth's car pull into the lot. She stepped out, casually, elegant, in a navy blue sweater, slim jeans and brown leather boots. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the morning sun as she walked toward him. Mark smiled and wiped his hands on a rag. Didn't expect company this early. Elizabeth returned the smile, a soft glint of mischief in her eyes. I couldn't wait any longer. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Mark blinked, caught off guard. She handed it to him without a word. His calloused fingers hesitated before flipping it open. Inside was a plain silver band, simple, unadorned, and yet more meaningful than anything ornate. He looked up, searching her expression. Elizabeth. She held up a hand, stopping him gently. It's not what you think, she said with a playful laugh. I'm not proposing marriage yet. But my father used to say that a ring didn't always have to mean romance. It could be a promise, a bond, a vow to stand by something you believe in. Mark's chest tightened. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered with emotion. You believed in this project, she continued. In me. In a vision most people would have written off. You saved my father's dream when even I almost gave up. So this, she gestured to the ring, is my way of saying I'm committed to everything we've built together, to our partnership, our shared future. Mark slipped the ring onto his finger slowly. It slid on as if it had always belonged there. He swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. Say it's a promise, Elizabeth whispered. To keep showing up. To keep building something real. He reached for her hand, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. Then I promise. Every bolt, every blueprint, every day. I'm in this with you. They stood quietly amid the familiar clinks and echoes of the garage, the hum of machinery in the background, like a soundtrack to their lives. Then slowly, Mark leaned forward, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that said more than words ever could. It wasn't dramatic. There were no chandeliers or fanfare. But it was perfect. And in that quiet corner of Portland, beneath the soft glow of morning light, they made a vow not bound by tradition or spectacle, but by something far more enduring: purpose, partnership, and love. From the dusty workshop, where a struggling mechanic toiled to keep his father's dream alive, to the opulent estate of a woman determined to uphold her father's legacy, Mark and Elizabeth's journey is a testament to hope. Their story proves that dedication, sincerity, and compassion can overcome any obstacle. Be it corporate pressure, financial hardships, or personal heartbreak. As you've shared in their struggles and triumphs, we invite you to keep this spirit of perseverance alive in your own life. If their journey moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Together, let's celebrate stories that remind us of the power of faith, love, and selflessness. Your support helps us continue creating content that inspires and uplifts. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes it only takes one leap of faith, one act of kindness to turn an impossible dream into a living reality.